Welcome to Massey College, and welcome to this session of Massey Loves to Read. I am delighted that you're joining us today for a great book. Massey College, as you know, is built on Indigenous land, the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. We want to acknowledge the stewardship of the land and also our gratitude for the ability to meet here, even virtually. So today it's part of our series about great books, and Planet Canada is one of them. It's a book that everyone should read. And to lead the discussion, we could not have a better person than Brett House. So right away, I'm just going to pass the virtual mic to Brett and thank him and thank John Stackhouse for being part of this celebration of his book, as well as our guests today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to all of you for joining us this afternoon or whatever time it is where you're logging in. I know we have alumni and friends and members of the Massey community joining us from multiple continents today, so welcome. It is my pleasure to be facilitating our conversation today to celebrate the launch of John Stackhouse's book, Planet Canada, How Expats Are Shaping the Future. It's a real delight to be here, particularly because this marks another moment or data point, which is testament to my old adage that John Stackhouse not only gets an incredible amount done, he sees and perceives and divines with wisdom an awful lot of things. And this takes him into the expat space, having previously written about Timbit Nation in his travels across Canada, and in a series of other writings, both in his current role and in the past, as a nationally best-selling author and one of Canada's leading voices on innovation and economic disruption. We're joined today as well by Sabrina Dellen, who is a civic engagement and access to justice advocate, and at Massey, our Open Democracy Fellow. Additionally, Nurjehan Mawani, Senior Fellow and an accomplished public servant and activist, will also be commenting on the book. I'll introduce all three of them just before they speak, and I want to encourage you from the start of the broadcast now to begin putting questions into the chat. I will be collecting those and putting them into our interactive discussion after the remarks from John and the reflections from Sabreena and Nurjehan. And you should feel very welcome to keep putting them in as we go through our conversation today. We wish we could be all together, but we're very grateful that we can be together and apart in the way that we are just now. So just before I turn things over to John to review some of the major arguments and themes from his book, I do want to expand on his introduction. John is currently Senior Vice President in the Office of the CEO at Royal Bank of Canada, and he leads the organization's research and thought leadership on economic, technological, and social change. Previously, he was editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail and editor of the Report on Business within the Globe and Mail. He is a senior fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and he sits on the board of Queen's University, the Aga Khan Foundation of Canada, and the Literary Review of Canada, many places and organizations and institutions close to the Massey community. His latest book, Planet Canada, which we're discussing today, explores the untapped resource of the millions of Canadians who don't live here, but exert their influence on Canada and the world from afar, what he calls our 11th province. So John, with that, I'd like to turn things over to you to discuss your book and how you see it contributing to the discussion here in Canada and around the world.
Great, thank you so very much, Brett. Brett's a good friend and a friendly rival. I've got enormous respect for him. So I'm only sad that we're not together in person, but that day hopefully is coming fairly soon. Natalie, thank you so much for hosting this, and to all the people at Massey for helping launch the book and for hosting so many essential conversations to our civic discourse and our collective understanding of Canada and the world around us. I feel very attached to Massey, in part because I grew up across the street at Wycliffe College, where my father taught for a number of years, and I've been associated with the monk school also for a number of years. And when I started to work on this book project, I would sneak down the street to Massey to get some fresh air and maybe a bite with my friends there. In fact, we launched my last book at Massey in person, Mass Disruption. So it's a beautiful echo to do it again, even virtually. I'm going to talk for 15 minutes. I've set my timer on, so I'll cut myself off if we get to that, because I really want to hear from the group and get into some good discussion about some of the issues I hope this book puts on the table. But let me start by asking why this topic, why this book, which I get asked a lot. I think the idea for this book first hit me back in the 1990s. I was a foreign correspondent for the Globe and Mail, lived in India for close to 8 years, traveled all over Asia and Africa, and would always meet the most interesting Canadians in kind of the unlikeliest of places. Some of them were up to no good. I followed the Khatter family through Pakistan and Afghanistan and covered the Briex scandal in the 1990s. But by and large, the Canadians out there struck me as incredible, not only incredible people, but incredible assets to our country that we completely ignored. And I kind of parked that away and didn't know what to make of it until I moved back and settled in. And then, of course, 9/11 hit us. And as the time passed, as the years passed through the 2000s, and Canadians started to turn in a way against our expats and global Canadians, even mocking them, which I get to in the book. And the federal government started to pull back some of the rights and privileges of overseas Canadians, understandably to a degree because of the way national security evolved post 9/11. But again, regrettably, because we as a mid to small size country were losing perspective of the strategic asset that we have in our global population. And that really gave me some conviction to take this on as an issue. We covered it in the Globe and railed about it a bit on our editorial pages. And I then went on to write this book, as I said, situating myself briefly at the monk school, where we put together a research team that was able to kind of lay the groundwork for a proper analysis of this community. And we started with an assessment of how big is this community, because it's hotly debated. Are there 1 million Canadians out there, 2 million, 3 million? So we went and explored censuses, not just the Canadian census, but censuses in other countries that ask about country of origin. We cross-referenced, and then critically we're able to get a good cross-analysis with Facebook data to understand where people who identify as Canadians are in the world, and came to a strong view that there are at least 2 million Canadians out there, which was why I called it our 11th province. This is a significant population. And while we may not constitutionally want to declare it a province, we can get into that debate in the open session. I think philosophically it's important to see it as valuable to the country in that sense of being a province of people. And we need to think beyond geography, beyond borders, in terms of understanding what Canadian means in the world. And this is even more critical now coming out of this pandemic. And I want to talk a bit about why it matters now more than even before the pandemic, when I did the bulk of the work on this idea. But from that foundation of initial research, I set out over the last few years getting to know a big range of Canadians all over the map. Some of these people I met in person. A lot of them we connected over the internet and through long phone conversations, came to know each other better. And I came to understand the place of not just Canada, but of Canadians in the world. And I want to share maybe just a few examples, illustrations of this, just to give you a sense of what Canadian means out there in the world today. We all know the famous Canadians, the Mark Carneys or the Jim Camerons in Hollywood, or the celebrities, Ryan Reynolds and the like. And that's great. It's great to have celebrated Canadians out there. But the vast majority of these 2 million Canadians out there are people you've never heard of, doing remarkable things. I'll start with the Stowskis. Martina and Simon, U of T grads, who, like many U of T grads, decided as soon as they graduated, they were footloose. They wanted to get out in the world. I was like that after graduating. And so they took off and went to Korea to do what Canadians typically do in Korea, which is teach English as a second language. But they discovered when they settled into Korea that there was something about being Canadian that had a value. And this was around 2010, not just in Korea, but across Asia. They understood other cultures differently than other expats understood those cultures. And they were able to tell the stories of those cultures in different ways, respectfully, curiously, and with an open mind. And as they described, as the Stowskis explained to me what they do, and what do? They run an incredibly successful YouTube channel in Asia. They are YouTube stars as Canadians, first in Korea, now in Japan, explaining their cultures, their newfound cultures, to the rest of the world. And as I got to know them, they said, we're able to do this because we're Canadian. So it may help me realize there is a value to the Canadian perspective out there in the world. I think it was Simon Stowski said, you know, when we get to someone's door and they say, take off your shoes, we take off our shoes. We don't think that's weird. And I thought there's a beautiful illustration of the Canadian mentality. We understand what we commonly call mutual accommodation. I get into that in the book, how this is a critical value for Canadians and for Canada out in the world, this idea of mutual accommodation. We also are action-oriented. I learned this through another Canadian, Joanne Liu, who until recently was head of Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, Doctors Without Borders. Incredible emergency doctor, Joanne is, who's worked all over the world in emergencies and ran MSF through a number of global crises, including the Ebola crisis. And it was during that time when she was leading the charge in many ways against Ebola in West Africa and pounding tables everywhere she could get to get action to stop what could have become a global pandemic. To work as a Canadian, getting things done. She knew how to work with other governments, with other cultures, with private sector organizations and public sector organizations, with global institutions and local institutions to get things done. So again, something to being Canadian. We respect and understand other cultures. We're curious, we're open-minded, respectful, and we get things done. We just don't sit back and observe. But she also opened my eyes to an incredible frustration of so many Canadians out there in the world that as a country, we're not getting things done in the way that we might have done in decades past, and not in the way that most Canadians want to get things done. And I hope this book helps us realize that in order to do that, we can't keep doing things as we did going back to the Pearsonian age. We have to think into a very different future, the 2020s, and approach the world in a different way, much more strategically than we have in the past. And the person who opened my eyes to ways of doing this is a man named Rayford Wallace, an incredible architect from Quebec, who went to China almost immediately after graduation from McGill in the early 2000s. Rayford had no Chinese experience or background. His parents were great wanderers to the world, but he wanted to go somewhere as an architect to where new buildings were being built every day. And he realized Shanghai was the place for him. He landed in Shanghai knowing almost no one, having no credentials, got hired as a local architect, and stayed to not only become a successful architect, but to become one of China's pioneering green architects. And Rayford has transformed the way China makes buildings, helping China come to grips with the toxicity of building products, which is actually an enormous problem. It's not just the air pollution and carbon emissions that are GHG emissions that China produces, the toxic building materials that come from these cities that are going up overnight is a planet for China and for the planet that Rayford is taking on. And he's doing that through another element of being Canadian, which is working with different people in different levels of government, in the private sector, and internationally. And from China, Rayford, believe it or not, a Quebec kid from China, has built a multinational organization with offices in Quebec City and Chicago, as well as Shanghai, and clients all over the world that are interested in his technology and his IP. Rayford could do this from Canada. He could do it from the US. He could do it from China, which is where his family is. His children are born and raised there and where he wants to be. But he wants to do it as a Canadian. He is still fiercely proud of being Canadian. And if there's a tragedy in Rayford's story, which is what I hope the book communicates constructively to Canadians, is that we have no idea who he is or what he is doing. And thousands, if not millions of Canadians out there, like Rayford Wallace, are sitting there, going about their business, getting things done, but waiting for the phone to ring, waiting for Canada to call and say, we want to help you and we want you to help us in whatever you're doing. In terms of Canada's relationship with China, not just diplomatically, but in terms of developing commercial opportunities, architectural opportunities, perhaps. Rayford wants to be on Team Canada. Joanne Liu wants to be on Team Canada. The Stowskis in Tokyo want to be on Team Canada. This is an enormous opportunity for us in the 2020s. And let me stress, before we turn it over to conversation, a few reasons why we have to come to grips with this. This is not a nice to do thing. This is not a feel good, let's be happy to be Canadian idea. This is a must do for Canada and our relevance in the 2020s and 2030s. Why would that be? Number one, we are shrinking. We are becoming smaller as a country in terms of our share of GDP, of global population, of global defense spending, global development spending. That's just a factor of the rise of the rest. It's not the fault of Canada. But if we are going to maintain or possibly grow our influence in a world that is becoming bigger and frankly a little more divisive, we are going to have to use networks and networks of Canadians because we are becoming smaller in size, which takes me to point number two. Why does it matter? Because we have moved into, from an age of institutions, we have moved into an age of networks. When you look at the forces in the world this year beyond the virus that have transformed the world, they are networks. Black Lives Matter, Greta Thunberg and what she's doing. These are networks that are more powerful than institutions or governments or multinational corporations in many ways. And so if we as a small country of 40 million people, size of a big city in many parts of Asia today, we are going to have to seize on the power of networks. And the power of networks is something that Canadians generally don't appreciate because it's not a one-to-one power. It's an exponential power. If you spend time in Silicon Valley, you understand exponentiality, the power of 1 to 10. And we have the ability with our network of expats to use exponential power for Canada's interests, for our self-interests in the 2020s. For every Canadian out there who's working or is on Team Canada, for every one Rayford Wallace, he can connect us with 10 people. And therefore a country of 40 million people can suddenly have the influence of 400 million people. We're going to need that to enhance and protect Canada's interests in the 2020s and beyond, whether it's on climate, whether it's on trade, whether it's on human rights, whether it's on culture, on and on. We will need to seize on exponentiality. Why else do we need it? Well, the world coming out of the pandemic is going to be, as I said, more divided. Old alliances are not going to hold. They probably weren't going to hold before the pandemic. Surely we've seen through the pandemic how important international cooperation is, but also how fragile it is. So we will need to be a little more nimble and strategic in our thinking and learn from smaller powers. One of the criticisms I've been trying to raise of in my discussions of the book around Canada is too often we comfort ourselves in the blanket of being a middle power. In many ways, I'd rather be a small power than a middle power because small powers move nimbly, they can seize on opportunities. And when we think of our international population, we need to learn from the smaller powers of the world, from the Israels and Singapores that are able to use their global populations. Taiwan is another great example, as well as bigger powers. France and Australia are doing incredible things with their expats. to use that exponential reach out in the world. But it's the smaller powers that are able to enhance their interest in the world by using their expat networks. Happy in the discussion, Brett, to get into how other countries are doing, but I want to be mindful of time. So let me wrap up there and throw it over to others for a good discussion. But again, thank you, Brett, and the folks at Massey for hosting this discussion and for advocating this idea of a Planet Canada, of using an incredible population of 2 to 3 million Canadians out there who today we're kind of ignoring and want to be used to enhance our country's place in a very different world coming out of this pandemic.
Thank you, John, for giving us that potted view on what is really deep, nuanced, and extensive argument in your book for a more networked, more nimble, and more expansive Team Canada. Two of the things that occurred to me on reading your book was the new notions of citizenship that it implies and the need to think about not just what we want Team Canada to look like, but how we transition to that new view of Team Canada. And for that conversation, we really have two fantastic members of the Massey community to reflect on the book and some of the comments that you made just now. I'm going to first introduce Sabrina Dellen and and hand the microphone over to her, and then turn to Nurjehan Mawani. Sabrina, as I mentioned, is the Open Democracy Fellow at Massey, which is a role co-created with the Simon Fraser University Morris J. Wosk Center for Dialogue and Open Democracy. Sabrina is also the founder of Signal Strategies, an engagement firm committed to social change and innovation. She has directed a wide range of research and outreach initiatives aimed at advancing public-centered justice and system improvements. Sabrina, thank you for bringing all your wisdom to this conversation, and I'm turning things over to you.
Thanks, Brett, and thanks everyone. It's such a pleasure to be in this group, and just to say I really enjoyed reading this book. What struck me was the ache in the wide range of the interviewees to have a stronger connection with Canada, and wanting almost a kind of approval as a son or daughter of a proud country. And I think that experience is actually quite Canadian. Many second-generation immigrants, I'm one of them, are often one of the first in their families to have post-secondary and professional opportunities at a certain level. And it's a community effort to get to that station, but upon arrival, it can be quite alienating. You might have jumped a class above your parents. You might be trying to figure out how to manage your career because you don't have generational knowledge to rely on for that. And in the midst of all this, you might also be carrying model minority baggage. Don't make a fuss, don't take up too much space, be nice, and get the job done to a high standard. Doesn't that sound like middle power behavior? So I saw some parallels to other immigrant experiences, and the frustration from the expats interviewed in the book really resonated with me, and I'm sure other readers as well. They want to feel valued, supported, and think big, but where they're coming from and what they see can feel threatening to some. But it's not just that they're getting a cold shoulder. We're a young country, and like first-generation professionals, we're still pulling together the infrastructure to mobilize social capital from our diaspora. Even the concept that there is a Canadian diaspora seems to be part of the challenge. And as the book argues, there's so much to be harnessed in terms of information, influence, and solidarity that can shape Canada's next chapter. For me, there are so many, interesting profiles and interviews in the book, but two individuals that stood out for me were Yasmin and Ahmed, who made that leap from second-generation immigrant to expat. And there's a significant status distinction between those terms. As we look to rebuild and recover from the pandemic, we're going to need this new generation of leaders that is adept at balancing tensions. They can move from top down to bottom up, from one culture to another. That mutual accommodation that John was just talking about is readily accessible. The Yasmins and the Ahmeds are aware of their intersectional identities. They can engage in a range of spaces. They're ambitious, and they embody Canadian values in a 21st century way. They also show that Canada reflects the world, The book notes that children with immigrant backgrounds will grow by 50% during this decade. And this is a decade that can, hopefully, be all about innovation as we aim to build back better. This moment is an opportunity to redouble Canada's efforts in science, the arts, design, architecture. It was so inspiring to read about all the Canadians in the book who have made major contributions in those areas. We could be on the cusp of a new golden age with our diaspora. This period of transformation could bring forth a more mature and more nuanced approach towards Canadian identity and culture. We can evolve it. And I also really enjoyed reading about the efforts from Alison Lote to develop a diaspora strategy and how we are long overdue to harness that social capital. Maybe we just needed to wait for the right generation at the right time. There's nothing more Canadian than balancing tensions. And as we contemplate our country's influence for this century, I think we should be betting on people that will enhance our position on the world stage and open doors for other Canadians. That's, as John argues, really underappreciated within our borders. And also just to focus on, it's not about who leaves and who is left. That figured quite prominently in the interviews. But that instead it can be about supporting this 11th province in a way that fosters belonging, connection, relevance, and also advancement for all of us. So those were, some of my kind of thoughts and considerations after reading the book.
Thank you, Sabreena. I think, you highlight something that's a really interesting element of both the argument in the book and I think post-nationalist discussions of what Canada is. The idea that within a single generation, someone who is a second generation immigrant can be an expat at the same time is in many ways a real embodiment of that post-nationalist nationalism that we may be talking about here as Team Canada here and abroad. Someone who has been very much a global Canadian in all senses of the word is Nurjehan Mawani, who has served as the Aga Khan's Development Network diplomatic representative to the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan from 2013 to 2019, and to the Kyrgyz Republic from 2005 to 2013. She's also had a long and distinguished career with the Canadian Public Service, where she served as Commissioner of the Public Service Commission of Canada, advisor on diversity to the Canadian School of Public Service, and as chair of the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada. Additionally, she was co-founder of the International Association of Refugee Law Judges. Ms. Mawani is a recipient of the Order of Canada and the Outstanding Achievement Award of Public Service Canada. In 2004, she was given an honorary doctorate by the University of Ottawa, and in 2018, she received an honorary doctorate of Humane Letters from the American University of Afghanistan. She joined Massey College's community as a senior fellow this autumn, and she also serves on the Anti-Black Racism Council of the college. We are so lucky to have you with us as part of our community, Nurjehan, and I look forward to your reflections as a very global Canadian.
Thank you very much, Brett, and thank you all for this opportunity, and Massey College particularly, to be part of this conversation. I think for me, one of the geniuses of Canada is that we can be Canadian, one can be Canadian and have multiple identities and be very comfortable in this space. And I think that in itself then enables us as Canadians to be out there in the world with that, the experience, the confidence, and I want to develop that a little bit further. When we, and I'm talking about myself, I'm talking about my children and others that I know, that when we go and become expat Canadians, or we become expat Canadians, we do so with this sense that there is some security for us. There is a safety net for us, which is not the case for many
in many other parts of the world. So those of us who have come from countries or may have come from countries where these things were missing, there has been a level of exposure, there has been an opportunity, and now when we go to other countries in the world, it may be for our personal opportunities, it may be to serve, we are taking that confidence with us and the values that we have embraced with us. Now, one of the things, perhaps I can move this conversation slightly to the current situation. I mean, John, we have talked about, and Sabreena, about the pandemic and its impact. What I have seen in the countries that I have been in, and what we are all seeing now, is an increased fragmentation in the world. We have seen this heightened as a result through COVID. We have seen, but even before that, we've seen the gaps between the haves and the have-nots increasing exponentially. And Canada has a role, and Canadians have a role, and they are playing that role in countries, in areas, in regions which are fragile, where the distinctions between the haves and poverty is very high. And I wanted to talk about this in the context of how do we support these countries through Canadian networks, Canadian institutions, to become competitive, because ultimately to become competitive will be the way to be able to become self-sufficient, prosperous. There is also the whole aspect of peace and stability. And I like to think of Canadians and transferring and contributing to the development of knowledge societies in these countries. And I want to give you an example of Central Asia, where I have been for a number of years, and the role of, for example, the University of Central Asia, a mountain university, and intended to be a great economic driver, a project of the Aga Khan and three Central Asian republics, but led by Canadians. Canadians have been engaged at multiple levels in this institution. And the idea of stabilizing those societies and that region with economic development, but capacity building, human capital in a way that is going to be relevant for them. So the role that we can play as Canadians, individual, whether it's, as I said, networks, institutions, individuals, is going to be, and I have seen that, and the level of acceptance of Canadians has been also very, very reassuring and heartening. Why? I think that has already been eloquently described by Sabreena and by John and in the book. But I think I've seen for myself that there are Canadians everywhere, in every single area, doing all sorts of amazing things. So then how are we going to mobilize these Canadians? How are we going to harness the Canadians? And my one suggestion and thinking is that we need to make this a process. And these dialogues which engage multiple stakeholders, and I'm going to suggest that government is really important in this. Government, private sector, institutions, academia, media, and civil society is obviously part of that. Media will be part of civil society, are going to have to play a really key role in helping us to get to answer John's call to action. Where do we need to be? How can we get there? I think we know where we need to be, but how do we get there? And so I think maybe one more point, if you allow me, is that perhaps the book has not touched on the role of volunteers and the harnessing this incredible resource of Canadian volunteers who actually are all over the world too, just as and through the networks that they have built and the areas that they are working, is another resource. And I've been trying to reflect, and maybe I can share with you that there's ways in which we can harness this to do what? to continue to expound Canadian values, but to help to build institutional capacity, build human resource capital, to stabilize, to promote values of human rights and pluralism. And there's a project that the Aga Khan referred to in the Parliament speech in 2014, but perhaps we can get into that in the discussion, because I think there's a very interesting model there for Canada.
Well, thank you for those reflections. John, I'd like to turn it back over to you for your first responses to some of the issues and ideas that were just raised, and then we'll move into taking some of the questions that are coming up in the chat and that we discussed before going live today.
Well, boy, there's enough to chew on there for another hour probably, so I'll have to be quite insufficient in addressing. I've been taking notes here because there was so much to think about. The point that Sabreena raised about intersectionality is really, really interesting, and I'm so glad that she caught on the millennials who I spent time with in London, who had grown up exactly as second-generation Canadians, and then wanted to go out in the world, but not to go back to their ancestral country, which is a bit of the kind of the traditional pathway. They wanted to take on the world. But they were seeing an opportunity that I don't think Canada has quite recognized, that they represented a new Canada and also represented a different kind of world and could bridge the two in ways that probably our traditional approaches to diplomacy, but also to international business and international organizations may not suffice. So I think there's a really important opportunity here for the country to seize on. And you just look at demographics, that we're going to see all those, that wave of immigration that began in the late 1980s, through the 90s and 2000s. All the children born to those newcomers are now coming of age. You see this on our campuses across the country. It's fantastic. So our campuses look like the world. Well, our diaspora is pretty soon going to look like the world. Think of the strategic opportunity there for Canada if we mobilize that a little more strategically. And then, as Nurjehan was suggesting, we do have Canadians everywhere, hiding usually in plain sight. They don't their maple leaf on their sleeve the way they backpackers tended to in the past. And we have to think of new ways of harnessing their brain power and their networks. And that will take a different kind of diplomacy. And this is an interesting challenge for governments to think through. How do traditional channels of diplomacy, which can be very effective, but also can be ineffective because of bureaucracy and rules and culture, how do they connect with expat communities that tend to be, people who leave their country out of choice tend to just have a different mindset and a different approach to challenges than you might through traditional bureaucratic channels. And in many communities that I spent time with, there was this recognition that we don't get each other. The expats don't get the diplomats don't get the expats. And so apart from nice Canada Day parties, they don't really connect, let alone build things together. That onus is on us as Canadians to think through, how do we work through that challenge of different probably cultures, different approaches to problem solving, both effective in their own way, but probably need to work together differently in the future. So a generational opportunity and a bit of a cultural challenge to work through.
Well, I'd like to drill down just a little on this opportunity that you've identified here and the ache for recognition that Shireen noted, and Nurjehan's point that a lot of this boils down to the how of how we move forward from here. How do we make good on this desire for recognition? How do we make good on what are strong intentions? One of our community noted that, as you outline in the book, John, the idea of recognizing and drawing on expats isn't a new idea. Canada 25, Action Canada, others, Robert Greenhill, reports and research that you draw on have identified this as an issue for some time. What do we need to do now to move from recognition of an ache to realization of that opportunity. And I love all three of your reflections on this, but we'll start with you, John, and then move to Shireen and then Nurjehan.
No, you're absolutely right. I mean, this is in that classic Canadian way has been studied to death and overthought in some ways. So some simple opportunities that I've laid out in the book. Number one, let's just properly study this population. Doesn't need to be a massive exercise, but understand who they are, where they are, and what the policy options are for the country. I've laid, I hope, the groundwork for that in the book. More can be done. It can be done fairly quickly. Secondly, formally recognize this community and do that through methods that other countries, France and India, for example, have very effective recognition programs. They literally give a pin, like the Order of Canada, to the best and brightest of their expatriate communities. So how do we create that same sort of emblem or award or pin and give it to the best 50 or 100 every couple of years to say, thank you for your contributions outside of Canada's borders. This is separate from the Order of Canada. Thirdly, create a proper unit in government to represent and connect with the diaspora. I call it a diaspora. I've recommended situating this at Rideau Hall, making the Governor General effectively the head of the expat community, take it away from politics, perhaps. Others have argued that it's better located in global affairs or maybe in ISED. Let's argue that through, but create a proper unit, which countries, dozens of them around the world are doing this. And they are building very strategic efforts for this. India has a full kind of department within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to connect with overseas Indians, and they're putting them to work, if you will, to enhance and protect India's interests in the world, but also to connect them back to India for business opportunities, for cultural opportunities. So if we have this proper unit in government, wherever it's located, that will formalize the community and become a bit of a channel. And then lastly, create an event, which is another idea I've stolen from India, where every couple of years they have a day to recognize their best of the best of their global community, to bring them back to, let's say, Rideau Hall for a conference, if you will, but not just for the sake of the jamboree, but to harness their brain power and bring in government leaders, absolutely, but business leaders, academic leaders, science leaders, youth leaders, to sit down with the most interesting 50 or 100 Canadians out there in the world for a couple of days and understand what they're seeing that we're missing, but also test our ideas with them. Again, think strategically about this population.
Sabreena, do you think that's sufficiently intersectional, let's say, for the multiple identities and lenses that the expats we're talking about bring to this conversation?
Well, I mean, it's an important start. We have to start somewhere, and that's significant. I think from a cultural perspective, though, in the book, John talks about how Canadians are so good at telling other people's stories. Like we can be this insider, outsider, participant, observer. It would be great if we could advance Canadian culture so that we're a little less modest and can start telling our own success stories. A key piece in the book is the need to inspire young people and normalize the fact that you should and can travel, study abroad, do these things. So if we can make it, a cultural commitment to tell stories about our alumni, I don't know what the right word for it would be, but to use that as a kind of blueprint, the way universities do, that would be a good start. And then if we are going to tell these stories to inspire young people, we should make sure that it's affordable and attainable for them to do these study abroad or work abroad schemes in the way that Europe has. I think it's the Erasmus scheme. I can't quite remember. So there's lots of existing frameworks and structures for us to draw from. We just have to get over that sort of class anxiety that Canada has about, telling our own stories and feeling like it's too boastful and, we shouldn't have a feather in our cap. That's kind of too flamboyant or something, but we kind of have to get over it because this is not the decade for subtlety. Like, we really are going to have to push. So this is one very readily in reach way for us to do that. And also, just to share, I'm married to an American, and when I watch the Olympics with him, he thinks it's hilarious how often Canadian commentators use the phrase personal best. He thinks that's just hilarious because in American commentary, you're either the best or you're not, right? You either won or you lost. What's this personal best nonsense? And as John's book illustrates, we have best that we can talk about. Personal best is also good. We shouldn't lose sight of that. But we have so much to share and, so little to lose. Like, why don't we do that? So that can also be, stimulating for us economically, culturally, socially, and we can have like a significant sea change within like one generation. So.
Nurjehan, I'd love your reflections here too on the how of building on the lessons in the book.
Yes, and maybe I can just also pick up on a couple of the things that John and Sabreena have said is, clearly, we are not systematically and strategically harnessing our expat population, the global Canadians. That's clear. And I agree that, John, with a number of ideas that you've put forward from what other countries are doing, and you've given the example of France and example of India, and a suggestion that perhaps there could be an annual or 2-3 year event at Rideau Hall where we bring the sort of best and the brightest and the leaders. While I agree with that at one level, what I think would trouble me is that how are we going to ensure that those Canadians who are working all over the world, which John, you mentioned as well, who don't have that profile, but who are doing extraordinarily important work. They are working in design, in teaching, in building capacity at multiple levels. They are working in governance institutions, local institutions, and especially those Canadians who actually are going back to their countries of origin where they are able to, because they understand and they go with the Canadian perspective, the Canadian values also, and the Canadian confidence, quiet as that may be, but to be able to do that. So I'm trying to figure out a way in which we would also be able to recognize that huge, actually a very large number of people. And this, it takes me a little bit to the ache piece that I've spent so many years away in different places. I haven't, from that, at that grassroots level, more, those who are working at that level, and even in institutions, I haven't seen that sense of ache. And I'm wondering whether that is a little bit, I'll say one thing, maybe a little bit generational. There is a generation that perhaps is first generation and out there and is not looking at this in the same way. But the generation who do want to be in, we have to find a way. And I think that the way I would suggest is that through these multiple conversations that are happening now, that we put that as part of the response that we want to bring, so that they are validated and feel valued equally as the leaders who are, all the ones that you mentioned, John, in your book, and many others.
John, if you'd like to respond quickly, please do. I'm also going to pick up a question just after from some of our viewers.
Yeah, we as a country, despite our self-image, can be fairly cliquey. And often when we are building out formal networks or quasi-formal networks, especially from government, we go to the usual suspects, friends of friends. And that has a value, that can be effective. But I heard from these countless Canadians, incredibly successful at what they did, and they're too busy to go seeking out opportunities. but they're willing, if recruited, to do whatever it takes to help their country that they love. But it's the onus is on us to find them, I think, more than for them to find us. And I wrote a piece for the Globe a couple of months ago, quoting Tim Evans, who spent most of his career abroad, incredibly well respected in global health circles, lived and worked in Europe, in Washington, at Boston, at Harvard, in Asia and Africa, and was never kind of a go-to person for Canadians dealing with global health, which was a bit of a head scratcher to him. Tim, for a bunch of reasons, moved back to McGill or to Montreal last year to start McGill's to launch McGill's Global Health School, and quickly has been plugged into government as helping to lead the vaccine program. And Tim, was quoted in the article saying that Canadians don't think globally, and he was shocked when he sat down with a task force that he's helping to lead for the government, that his first question is, who do we need to talk to outside of Canada? And he found no one else in the group was even thinking that way. So that's just a bit of the global mindset that we need to be much more ambitious with. And then secondly, appreciate this generational shift, because the millennials out there, certainly the ones I encountered, don't want to wait. They're not going to wait to kind of rise up through the ranks or through the usual career path. They want to change the world today. And we have an opportunity to harness them, to connect them with other generations, to bring in various cultures. But you got to let them kind of run things and take us to places that we may not be immediately comfortable with, but it's their future more than ours. So how do we help them, especially the ones out there in the world, take us to maybe some new places as we come out of the pandemic?
We only have about 10 minutes left in our session, so I am going to pick up a few questions from the audience now and pose them first to Sabreena and then over to Nurjehan and John. Pick up whichever part of them you'd most like to respond to. There is a bit of a theme or a thread running through them around this notion of mutual accommodation that John observed, and the extent to which it may or may not teach us something as well about how we exist in the world and the opportunity that Canadians, expat Canadians present. Were you able to test the extent to which Koreans, for instance, or others saw this idea of being able to inhabit two spaces or mutually accommodate was truly something that they saw in Canadians as well? And on a related note, the modesty, Sabreena, that you noted is something maybe we need to sweep aside. Is that modesty itself one of our powers as Canadians in the world? So over to you, Sabreena first, and then Nurjehan and John.
I think the modesty can be a strength, absolutely. The book shows how Canadians are relied on for roles to be trusted advisors, facilitators. They're able to be really effective because they can bring people together. But sometimes we use the word modest when what we mean is scared. And we have to, I think, have a bit of awareness about that and not use modesty as an excuse. And, that ache that, we're all kind of connecting to here in the discussion is, well, the expats are saying this, but what's going on with the country? Like, why are they kind of turning away from us? Is it, this group is too fancy and they don't feel connected now? What's going on? Like, this can be a Team Canada win. Where's that disconnect coming from? And also just to add that if we're going to celebrate Canadian stories and if we're really going to leverage all that we can gain from this group, it shouldn't just be the stories of the elite, like the Silicon Valley Hollywood heroes that we read about in the book, but the community organizers and the mobilizers that, for instance, I'm sure there's several Canadians that are involved with the farmers' strike in India right now. Those are just as inspiring. We have such a wide range of stories to be telling that can, reflect our wins back to us, and it just is like this positive, energy moving around and building, just in terms of like the network theory that John was sharing as well.
Nurjehan?
Yes, I do agree with Sabrina on this about making sure that we have all of the stories. And I think what is so remarkable now is that the stories of Canada, of being Canadian, have become so much more. It has to reflect the diverse experiences, and now the whole, immigrant experience came to Canada and now is Canadian, and now in fact is becoming maybe an expat, but the whole stage in there. And the experience, I was recently, I'm sure you're all familiar with Deepa Mehta's the film and the book, and it's extraordinary. I read somewhere where she said that the objectivity that Canada provides, through which we can look at our respective homelands, is, I think, this country's greatest gift. And I think that's really quite profound, and in a way allows us to be this incredible bridge. And I think, John, you talk about mediators of the human narrative. I find that really, really stayed with me, because that is what, in many ways, has, I'll say, allowed us as Canadians to have a lot of influence and modesty. The term, I think it's, yes, I'm not so sure about scared, but it could be. But I think modesty I have seen that it has enabled us to be able to enter areas and talk to people and understand their narratives and not be top down, which has been a huge strength everywhere. So when there's a choice of who are we going to hire, who are we going to involve and engage, very often in the countries where they don't want a top down paternalistic approach, the Canadian way is very, very much more acceptable and welcomed. And through that, the influence.
John, over to you for a last word. I am so sad that we've already come close to the end of our hour. As you mentioned earlier, we've really just started on this conversation, and I wish we could continue it longer. But that's a mark of a book that has incited some great reflection.
Thank you, Brett, and thank you, Nurjehan and Sabreena, so much. I'd love to listen to you for the full session. I'm learning so much and filling my notebook with ideas that you're sparking. Maybe I can just wrap up with some thoughts on this point of mutual accommodation, which can sound like a grandiose term. It's really about being a bridge builders, and so many people I talk to in all walks of life around the world say Canadians are great bridge builders. Dominic Barton, now our ambassador to China, when he was running McKinsey, I interviewed for the book, said he could always identify the Canadians as the people who ask questions and listen to the answers, because you need to do that to build bridges. But there are Canadians who are, at the center of human rights battles in Europe and in Africa, who are bridge builders. They're not confrontationalists. They're bringing people together. I profile Canadians in the Persian Gulf who, in the design world, in the architecture world, and in the healthcare world, that are bringing together cultures, not easily or perfectly, but it's something that we are better at than many, and we're getting better at through the generations. And one of the favorite people I got to meet was a man named Eddie Schwartz, who's a songwriter in Nashville. For those of you of a certain age who remember Pat Benatar, he wrote "Hit Me With Your Best Shot." That was his big hit. And he is now running the International Society of Songwriters out of Nashville. And he had to negotiate an agreement on essentially IP rights, copyrights for songwriters. Building a bridge between the Europeans and the Americans. And they were at war with each other over this. And he was in shuttle diplomacy between Nashville and Brussels and Washington, had no legal expertise. But he said, his background as a Canadian, as a songwriter in the CBC, as well as growing up in Toronto. He said, I just understood how to work with different cultures, to listen to the answers when you ask a question, and find a common ground and then help people move from their positions to that common ground. And lo and behold, that became an agreement for songwriters, a sort of a quiet Canadian success. And that's what Canadians have been doing for generations. And it's so exciting to me that as a country, we can continue to do this. If we get our people, as Sabreena was saying, we've got to encourage the next generation and the generation after that to get out in the world, but to take us with them as a country. And then the onus is on us as a country to want to go with them and to let them take us to different places. And it'll take us to better places if we have faith in them as Canadians. So thank you again to everyone for being part of this conversation, and love to see, especially what the younger folks involved with Massey get to do in the years and decades ahead, taking us to a new planet, Canada. Thank you.
Well, as with almost every conversation at Massey, it really is just the first in the series. I already feel the need for a sequel coming on. In the early 90s, Richard Gwynne wrote a book about the unbearable lightness of being Canadian. And I think, if anything, today you've demonstrated the real heft to Canadians, both at home and in the world. You've laid out, all three of you, an agenda for being boldly modest, which, if I may, I can't think of a more Canadian epigraph than that, and the role that expats can play in helping us achieve that agenda and in furthering it abroad. So John, thank you for this contribution. Thank you for this book. Sabreena and Nurjehan, thank you for your thoughtful engagement with it today. Thank you for being part of the Massey community. Thank you to Massey for allowing us to come together like this, together but apart. Stay safe, everyone. Have a very nice holiday period and a very good start to the new year if we don't speak before then. Thank you, and hope to see you soon.